Hello, and welcome to Graywood Gardening, and welcome to what remains of the butterfly garden after the deer have eaten most of it. It's not quite as bad as it looks, but it is pretty bad. So I established this garden at the beginning of this year. I have just hours and hours and hours of footage of working on this that I never actually cut into anything. But basically we tilled this bed that's 10 feet wide by 100 feet long. I then tarped it with clear plastic to solarize it for a little over a month to let any seeds in the seed bank germinate and then get killed off. I took the tarp off, any grasses that were still there, I killed off with a flame weeder. I then put a couple of inches of compost over everything and then planted and planted and planted. Now, I only actually planted half of this garden. There was half of it, which is these little areas like this, that I was planning to start plants from seed over the summer and plant them out in the beginning of September. For various reasons, I didn't get to that. The stuff that I did plant, with one exception, was all either direct seeded or tiny little plugs that got put in the ground. So it was never going to look terribly impressive this year, but the goal was really to try to get a lot of these little perennials established. I also knew that the really aggressive deer that we have here in Graywood were going to eat some of the plants, and so part of this was also an experiment to see what the deer would eat and what the deer would leave alone. So I thought today it might be fun to walk you guys through the butterfly garden in its current state, show you guys what the deer have left alone, and what the deer have eaten and is completely gone. All right, and we can start right here in front with this guy. This is the butterfly bush. This is the one large plant that I planted. I have two of these, one on either end of the garden. So it is worth noting, because there's a lot of misinformation about the butterfly bush on social media. So butterfly bush is not native to Minnesota, but it is also not invasive in Minnesota. It can be invasive in other states, but in Minnesota, our winters take care of that. In fact, we have the opposite problem, where gardeners can struggle to get the butterfly bush to survive the winter, because it's actually a Zone 5 plant. Another common myth is that the butterfly bush is like junk food, and that butterflies come and drink the nectar like crazy, but it's not actually good for them, and it's just empty calories. There's actually university has done some research on that and has found that indeed the nectar contains nutrients that butterflies need. And even in its first year, tiny size with these tiny blossoms, the monarchs have been all over this. So I totally am a big fan and respect people who choose to only do native plants. I think it's a valid choice. I like to have some non-natives, and for something that is as popular with the butterflies as butterfly bush, to me, feels like a no-brainer here in the butterfly garden. That said, most of the plants here are natives. Starting, in fact, right here, this is Rattlesnake Master, and Rattlesnake Master is a host plant for the black swallowtail butterfly. I've got a clump of it here. It's establishing really well. The deer have left it alone, and so I'm very hopeful that next year, this whole section of the garden will be filled out with these Rattlesnake Master plants. All right, so this square right here in the garden, I did not plant deliberately. I have 4 sections like this throughout the garden, and the plan was to have certain big clumps of certain species that repeat throughout the garden. This is the areas that I was gonna grow over the summer that I didn't get around to doing. So that's like half the garden that is empty, and it's not the deer's fault. Okay, and here's a section of the butterfly garden that was supposed to be all annuals that I direct seeded. Obviously, the zinnias have been doing really, really well. The pollinators love them. I can see honeybees and bumblebees on them now. They're popular with the butterflies and with hummingbirds, and the deer left them alone. Now, unfortunately, all around this, the annuals didn't fare so well. I had a giant section of balsam, which is an impatiens right here. The deer devoured that. I had cleome here, the deer ate that. And I even had a bunch of Johnny jump-ups that the deer have eaten. A couple of them have held on to their life just barely, but 95% are gone. So I'm actually thinking next year, this section, I might just plant all zinnias. They're super bright and colorful. They're a good nectar source that the butterflies like. The deer leave them alone. feels like a no-brainer for a nice annual nectar source for the butterflies. However, just a little bit further up here, I have a handful of echinacea that got put in the ground, and the deer have been eating that pretty steadily. It hasn't died yet though. It keeps trying to grow and keeps getting eaten back, but I have a hunch that these guys are well enough established now that they'll survive the winter. We'll see how they do next year. All right, more stuff eaten over here. All right, so right here, nothing was planted. In here, we have goldenrod that I planted. Plugs, it's doing really, really well. All but one of them are really well established. The deer have left the goldenrod alone. We have some yarrow here. This one has been left alone. This one's been eaten by something, but I don't think that's the deer. I think the deer leave the yarrow alone. I also had a bunch of columbine, Minnesota native columbine, planted up here. That stuff got eaten to the ground. Most of it died. There are two, I think, that are trying desperately to regrow, but they are so little and it's so late in the year. I have a hunch it's probably too late for these guys and they're not going to survive the winter. And life gets even worse as we move over this way just a little bit. In this section of the garden, I had a bunch of meadow blazing star, which is a liatris. They all got eaten by the deer. I had a bunch of lupine, Minnesota native lupine, which is also the host plant for an endangered butterfly. That was the very first thing to get eaten. The lupine was clearly candy for the deer. So the lupine all got devoured and is gone. A bunch more Johnny jump-ups here that also got eaten. Looks like 2 of them are alive. Things are a little bit more successful up this way. All right. A bunch of stuff is actually alive in this section of the garden. At the very front, we have downy wood mint, which is in the mint family, as you can imagine, and deer generally don't eat anything in the mint family, so I was pretty confident those were going to be good, and they bloom pretty early in the year, which was the goal with them. Behind them, we have butterfly weed, which obviously any milkweed deer will not eat. It's the host plant for the monarchs, super important. We've got a good patch of it getting established. I'm very confident this will be coming back again next year. Behind that, I have some agastache. Looks like only 3 out of the 4 made it, but the deer have left. This is agastache, also known as anise hyssop. The deer have left this alone. It's also in the mint family, so I was expecting that. I think I might have planted this a little bit close to butterfly weed. Next spring, I might actually move those back like a foot. But so like this front chunk of this section of the garden should fill out pretty nicely next year. I left this area where I'm kneeling now empty because I didn't know what I was going to plant here yet. Right up in front on either side of this path, this is the halfway point through the garden, on either side of this path I planted 50 common violets. These are native to Minnesota. It's the host plant for a whole bunch of different fritillary butterflies. And the deer have definitely eaten the violets, but the violets are hanging on. They keep coming back every time they get eaten. So I suspect these are also big enough that they're going to overwinter just fine. It is hard to kill a common violet that has been established. So super excited about how these guys are going to do. There's 25 on each side of the path. This little plant here is prairie clover. I have 2 different kinds. I have purple prairie clover and white prairie clover, and I have this seeded on both sides of the path. The deer did eat the prairie clover as it came up, but it was vigorous enough to keep coming up. It's still alive now. I have to assume that it's going to survive the winter. Clovers are an important host plant for the sulfur butterflies, so things like the orange sulfur and clouded sulfur and stuff. So very happy that these survived. Again, I'm imagining we'll be in a world where the deer come through and they nibble on the violets and they nibble on the clover, but the plants will actually survive. Violets, by the way, in addition to being a host plant for all the fritillaries, also one of the earliest flowers to bloom, so good early season nectar. All right, so the next section over here is a big stretch that I didn't actually plant, and then at the end is some stuff that I did. Okay, and down at the very far end of the butterfly garden, on this end, the ground is a little lower, there's a little bit of a slope, and this end gets some shade, whereas the other end is just baked in the sun for like 12, 14 hours a day. So I tried putting some plants that need a little bit moister soil, even though the still is pretty sandy soil. So back here I have 4 Joe Pye weed. The idea is this will be a giant clump in the back of this bed. Joe Pye weed, super popular nectar flower for butterflies that's native and gets really big. And here in front I have some ironweed. Ironweed is another native, another butterfly host plant. And I actually thought I had lost these because in the couple months that I ignored the butterfly garden, this entire area was solid thistle, and everything back here was actually solid wild raspberry. So I came in here just in the last couple of weeks and pulled every single thistle out of the area and slowly discovered that these plants had actually survived. They are a little leggy as a result. So I am not sure if the deer have left the ironweed and the Joe Pye weed alone because they won't eat it, or if they left it alone because it was buried in thistle. But certainly in the week since I've weeded it, nothing has come through and eaten these guys. So fingers crossed, they look like they're decently established and will survive the winter. And this of course brings us back to the second butterfly bush. I put one on either end in hopes that the climate in one is going to be good enough to let it survive the winter. We got it more moist on this end, a little bit more shady, much more protected. That end is much better draining, much drier, but also just gets baked with the sun. All right, well that is everything that I have for the butterfly garden for you. Certainly the butterfly garden is going to be a lot more impressive next year. I'll be planting a few big blocks of annuals, as well as establishing a lot more perennials. And I got a bunch of bulbs yet to put in the butterfly garden this fall. But this is definitely the kind of project that is going to take several years before it's looking really good. And this year definitely did not go as well as planned, although I was counting, and I actually have over 4 dozen perennials that successfully got established, and that's not counting the 50 violets and the 100 or whatever prairie clover. So it's really a good number of plants and some very large plants getting established. It's just over 1,000 square feet, that still leaves most of it empty, which leaves a lot more work for next year. All right, that is everything that I have for you today. I will see you next time, and until then, happy gardening.